Hey everyone, I'm Mitch. I'm one of the pastors here, and you're watching another episode of Suncrest on Demand. Let's get going.
How's everybody doing? Good. It's good to be with you today, celebrating those baptisms. That's awesome. I appreciate how you join in that celebration. I want to start with a question for you because this is a question that came up at our staff lunch on Tuesday. I was absolutely shocked at some people's answers, and so I want to test it out on you. Let me give you a little context. You might think during our staff lunch we're having conversations about theological things, about the richness of spiritual. That is not what's happening. We're having a conversation about reality TV, okay? And this reality TV conversation went from The Real Housewives to Vanderpump Rules, okay? Then we went to some older stuff, like Survivor and The Amazing Race. And I always thought someone at Suncrest and I are someday going to do The Amazing Race together. Maybe it's you. I don't know. But then we ended up going old school and we went all the way back to Fear Factor. Do any of you remember the show Fear Factor? Okay. So basically the premise of this show is, hey, you got to do stuff and you can win some money if you do it. And basically this question came up. Would you eat a large live spider for $50,000? Would you eat, there is a right answer and a wrong answer to this question. Would you eat a large live spider for $50,000? Who says no? Seriously? I thought our church was tougher than this. How many of you say, absolutely, for 50 grand, I would absolutely eat? You are my people, right? You're my people. Because I'm like, of course you would do that. Of course you would eat a real live spider. Now, it's possible that some of you who just raised your hand are still sickos because you actually would like to eat a real live spider. You're like, double bonus, I get 50 grand and I get to eat a real live spider. That's not how I see it. That's not how I see it. I see it as temporary suffering for cold, hard cash. And you got to kind of take this into account, right? You're like, well, it's not like I'm out in the wild eating a spider. I'm on a TV show. They've clearly, nobody's going to die. That's kind of built into the system, right? They got cameras all over the place. If I start to get a little sick, I'm going to be in the ambulance and whatever. How long is it going to take? Do it in 20 seconds. $50,000. Did I change anybody's mind? No, verbally. Anybody? All right. Well, that will slightly relate to tonight's message, okay? I listen to a lot of sermons, and I heard a sermon years ago from someone that I really, really respect. And he had a line in the sermon, and he kept saying it over and over again, and I'll never forget it. He said this, he said, suffering is inevitable. Misery is optional. Suffering is inevitable. We will all experience it to different degrees all throughout our life. Suffering is inevitable. Misery is optional. The way that we handle our suffering, the way that we see God, the way that we notice things, the way we handle situations, it's optional. And I think a lot of the section of Romans chapter 8 that I'm going to teach through today gets at that very idea, both parts of it. Now, if you've been with us, over the last few weeks, we've been doing this series called Wrestling. I'll finish it up next week. For 3 weeks of this, the last 3 weeks, I'm walking through Romans chapter 8, which is regarded by many as one of the richest theological treatises in the Bible. And it's pretty amazing. This week, I have 13 verses to cover in the middle of Romans chapter 8. And if you've been around, I like to kind of break things up and kind of draw out what the points are and some application stuff and kind of break up the passage. I tried to do that with this message, and I couldn't do it. So in just a little bit, I'm going to walk through these 13 verses, verse by verse by verse, and I'm going to explain some things as we go that I think will help us see it in our life. But the only way I know to do this is to let these 13 verses unfold. Included in these 13 verses is Romans 8:28. This is one of what I call the bumper sticker passages of the Bible. It's something that shows up lots of places. It's an oft-quoted verse. And sometimes because it's oft-quoted, it's actually caricatured. And by caricatured, I mean used and abused in ways that it actually wasn't intended to be in the first place. You may know this verse from Romans 8:28. It says, "For in all things God works for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose." It's a beautiful passage. It's a very meaningful passage. And at the end of our passage today, we will reflect on that very idea together. But I see people use that passage all the time to think that when you're going through something tough, God will just take care of it. They'll think that about their own lives, that, well, when I'm going through something tough, God's supposed to just take care of it. And that maybe I shouldn't even be experiencing this suffering, or it's suffering like it'll go away in a week or a month, or if I pray about it, it'll go away. And that's not what that passage is saying at all. And maybe the greatest malpractice of using this passage isn't when I apply it to my own life, but it's when you're going through something tough and I just quote it to you. And even though you're going through something very difficult, real suffering in your life, I think that somehow this verse brings a solution to you that this verse does not bring. And so I want to talk to us, both for those of us who are going through suffering, which is all of us to some degree, and for those of us who encounter others who go through suffering. I think Romans 8 is going to help us a great deal with that. Let me set a little context before I walk through these 13 verses. If you're with us last week, I hit this. It's going to be a big deal again today. Justification, sanctification, glorification. I know these are big church words. Justification is the moment you become a follower of Jesus. The way you're justified before God is not of your own effort. If you think God's going to let me into heaven because I'm a good person, let me say this as straight as I can. You're not going to heaven. You can't justify yourself. The scriptures are wildly clear about this, that the way people end up in heaven and with God is not because of their own behavior and because they justified themselves. Justification is from God, and justification is the moment someone becomes a Christian. And the way you do that is by surrendering yourself to God, yielding yourself, believing, trusting, putting yourself under him. It's beautiful. Sanctification is the process of living your life as a Christian until you die. So after you've experienced justification, the whole of your life, I would say most people in this room, if you're followers of Jesus, if you're Christians, then you're in this situation. You had become a Christian in the past and you're going to die in the future. You are in the sanctification years. And glorification is when you die that you will receive a glorified body, and this is the life in heaven with us. Now, Romans chapter 8 is all about sanctification. And I know that, again, these are big church words, and I actually heard someone using this once. I think they were imitating like a TV preacher, probably someone who'd asked you for money and wasn't teaching the right thing anyway. But he's like, oh yeah, I heard that once. He's like, I heard a guy go like, I've been sanctified, right? And whenever I hear that, I'm like, no. Actually, first of all, it sounds weird. Like, who would talk like that? But second of all, no one has been sanctified. It's not complete. That's actually the point of sanctification. You are being sanctified. And most of the ways that we are sanctified, if we look at it according to the scriptures, is that we go through hard things. That's what God uses to grow us. And the result of sanctification is that we look more and more and more like Christ until when we die, we receive a new body just as he did. It's going to be pretty important for today. That's what Romans 8 is about. You've seen me use this chart before. This is so important to understand everything, I think, about this world. That God created the world. It was perfect. It was just the way he wanted it to be. Like Adam and Eve lived in the garden, and there's perfect harmony with one another, but also with God. They spoke to him. There was no gap. It was like he was present. He was present. They just spoke. They talked back and forth. Actually, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but all of creation around them was peaceful, it was harmonious, it was beautiful, it was amazing. That's the way God created the world, and it's the way he wanted it to be. But he gave us a free will, gave Adam and Eve a free will, and they chose to rebel against God. And the moment they did, it introduced brokenness to this world. And you can use different words to kind of describe this. Sometimes it's called the fall. It's when people started to sin and rebel against God. But I like the word brokenness because it's the result of what happened. It means that today in your life you have suffering. You have heartache, you have pain. It's part of the nature of this life that we're going through. It's not the way God wants the world to be, but it is an honest assessment of the way the world is. And I need you to know as I go through this message today and talk about suffering, that I may not know yours personally, but this role that I'm in means most of my conversations with people are about the hard parts of life. People do not make appointments with our pastors just to let us know, be like, hey, just so you know, it's going pretty well. And, by the way, that's good. Don't set up an appointment to talk to us about that. But, I'm just rewinding over the last 60 days. I've had 4 or 5 conversations with people who've had cancer diagnoses, either themselves or in their family. I've had conversations with people who told me that the week before they were driving around trying to figure out where they would end their own life. And something happened and they didn't, and they ended up in my office a little while later. I've talked with people who have been betrayed in a marriage and surprisingly betrayed. Like did not see it coming, and all of a sudden, the person they were married to turned their back, cheated on them, walked away, and it's life shattering in that way. I have so much respect. I've talked to people who endured abuse as a child, and it's haunted them their whole life. And they're taking the first steps to say, I need to process that in a way that's healthier than I've ever handled it before. So much respect for that. This is just the nature of my world. We interact with people in the low parts of their life. I understand that people suffer. I, myself, it's not a competition, but have experienced suffering. You can probably imagine. I try to be real honest about my life from this platform, but I don't tell you everything. There are things that are off limits to you that have to do with me and my family and situations. And I'm just saying we all know this. And it's not lost on me that even, a week and a half ago, I was in Germany and my mom and I toured a concentration camp. And I think out of all the suffering that I just described to you, and there's a lot of heavy stuff, and again, it's not a competition, but oh my goodness, for a season in our world, this went on. This is my point. This is a broken world that you and I live in. And we should acknowledge that suffering is inevitable. Jesus is the one who said, in this world, you will have trouble. And the Bible's really honest about that. And it's not disconnected from our sanctification process. Third piece of context I want to give you is to ask this question. It's been a guiding question that someone gave me for life. It's helped me all over the place. And the question is this a problem to solve or a tension to manage? Almost any problem that you face and any difficulty that you face, any situation that you're in, it's helpful to diagnose it with this question. Because here's the thing. Some situations in your life are solvable. And it's a problem, and you should solve it. And some situations in your life are not solvable. It's just a tension, and all you can do with a tension is to manage it. But when we get these backwards, when we think we're going to be able to solve a tension, something that is a tension, it was a tension yesterday, it's going to be a tension tomorrow, and we think we can solve it, that is breeding ground for frustration. And if something is solvable, and you could solve it, but you decide just to manage it, that also is a recipe for misery. And one of the things that this passage does is it helps us to look at the things in our lives and say, well, is that solvable? Because if so, then take the steps to solve it. But many of these things are outside of our hands, and you can't try to solve it. You have to simply manage the tension that is there. And as we walk through this passage, I think that you will see many tensions, including a practice that embraces the idea that this will be a tension-filled experience for our whole sanctification process. So, with that, let's start the passage. Paul writes, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed in us. Now, I need you to know from the beginning, he's not being dismissive of your suffering or of mine. He's not acting like it doesn't matter. He's not ignorant of suffering. I'm going to tell you something about Paul's life in just a moment. But he absolutely is trying to help us see you should put two things on two sides of a scale. And there is the current suffering that all of us are going through to different degrees. And there is a future glory that outweighs them all. And this is the beginning of the tension of our lives. Many theologians have said it this way, and I hope you can keep this in mind. There's the tension of the now and the not yet. The now and the not yet. We live in the now. As followers of Jesus, we anticipate the thing that is not yet, that glorification that will one day come. And part of the tension of this life that we live is saying, yep, now and not yet. That's the tension. Now, again, Paul's not being dismissive. He uses the word I here, and he's actually talking about the sufferings he knows. And can I make the case that Paul's not being dismissive? Paul, you know what suffering Paul's gone through? Well, first of all, Paul, in a previous iteration of his life, worked to kill Christians, and he did. And then he had an experience with God that showed him the resurrected Jesus, and he became a follower of Jesus, but he has in his past all this regret, potentially, over the idea of what he did in his past. Anyone would carry that with you to some degree. That's who he was. When he became a follower of Jesus, he decided to give his life to spreading the message of Jesus. And in many places, you learn about the difficulties that Paul went through. Paul was falsely imprisoned multiple times. Paul was beaten. Paul was whipped. Paul was stoned and left for dead outside of a city once, like physically endured this suffering himself in ways that probably nobody in this room ever has. While he was trying to do the right thing in spreading the gospel, the ship he was on was shipwrecked, and he spent a day and a night in the open sea, hanging on to a board from that ship. This is the life that Paul has lived. When he says, I consider that our present sufferings, he's not talking like, I don't know, I'm sitting up in, he's endured it. Paul himself refers to something that seems to be wrong in his physical body. He calls it his thorn in the flesh. And part of his greatest frustration is he says, I have prayed for God to take it away, and he has not taken it away. That's the man who's writing this passage. And not only that, he is writing to the church in Rome. This is called Romans. And do you know what's going on in Rome for Christians while he's writing this? They're being not only persecuted, but martyred. In the Colosseum, thrown to the lions. Whatever we are going through, I just want you to know that Paul is not being dismissive of our sufferings. What he is doing is he's calculating it. And he's saying, this is real. This is real. But compared to the glorification that is coming, that far outweighs them all. And it does. It outweighs them in terms of time. What's going on right now is temporary. You might go through it for weeks or months or years, but it far outweighs them all. It's just perspective setting at the beginning of the passage. The passage goes on. He says, for the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself would be liberated from its bondage and decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. And I don't want you to miss this. When I say God created the world and the world was just the way he wanted it to be, we of course tend to think about the lens through the human experience, but he's actually talking about all of creation. The world was just the way God wanted it to be. And when you think about creation, you can think about a few things. Like, it's not just your life, it's your body, right? I don't know if you know this, but your body was originally not going to deteriorate. Your bodies are deteriorating. We're all very aware of that, right? Your eyesight's getting worse, you had a knee replacement, all those things. It's not the way that God wanted the world to be. But when rebellion came into the world, this is the idea. I don't know if you remember this from creation, but the scripture said to Adam and Eve, hey, Fill the earth and subdue it. The earth is subject to you. So when Adam and Eve messed up, it messed up all of creation. You know, it's funny to me sometimes, like, you can spend time in nature and appreciate the beauty of what God has created. But if you spend enough time in nature, you'll start to notice, like, yeah, not all of it's great. Like, there are wild animals, and they kill other wild animals. And if you ever catch that on video, like, it's not pretty. What is it? It's broken. It's not just that you're broken and I'm broken and our relationships are broken. It's that the whole creation is broken. And this is what part of what Paul is helping us to see. Let me read to you. Get this. This is a passage from Isaiah chapter 11 that is describing glorification, heaven, in light of creation after it's done. This is what it says. The wolf will live with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat. The cow will feed with the bear. Their young will lie down together. That's the way God wanted the world to be, even in the animal world. And it is the way the world will be. Will there be animals in heaven? Yes. And they'll be perfectly harmonious with each other. Even the ones that we think are naturally opposed, they're not naturally opposed. They're opposed in their brokenness. Then it says this, the infant will play near the cobra's den, and the young child will put his hand into the viper's nest, and you will eat a live spider. Oh, wait, it didn't say that. Didn't say that. It's just casting, you capture this, like we're part of creation, but one day creation will be put back together. Then the passage says this. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. And you see that in the brokenness of creation today. You see it in disease that's part of our bodies. You see it in storms and earthquakes and landslides. Like, what's happening? What's happening? It's not the way God wants the world to be. It is creation groaning because creation has become broken. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we are saved. And here in this passage, you'll notice it references the idea of groaning twice. It's going to show up one more time before the passage is done. And I want to cast a little vision for you today, and I'm perfectly serious about this. Groaning may be one of the healthiest spiritual practices that you could employ. Groaning. Groaning is that sense of, groaning is what happens on the path to childbirth, right? It's painful, it's hard, it's temporary, it's producing something better, something beautiful. But we're not pretending that it's beautiful right now. It's just groaning. And I want you to know that as a practice before God, groaning, I think, is a beautiful practice. Now, let me contrast groaning with a couple of practices I see people also take when suffering. There's a practice in the scriptures call the gnashing of teeth. Groaning is not the gnashing of teeth. The gnashing of teeth is when you've done something wrong. Actually, the gnashing of teeth is when you end up in eternity apart from God, and you look back, and it's this regret that now cannot be fixed. You're no longer in a process. You only look back at what was, and you're like, you don't want gnashing of teeth. You don't want the feeling of like, ugh, I missed it. I focused on all the wrong things during this life. I look back, now I have an eternity that's apart from Christ. You don't want that. That's not groaning, that's gnashing. Groaning is also not grumbling. Grumbling is when you're frustrated and you decide to vomit that frustration on other people, which is actually only spreading brokenness. The scriptures speak all the time about how a healthy follower of Jesus will not grumble. and no doubt some of us in the room are grumblers. I'm asking you to surrender your grumbling to the Spirit, to take that part of your sinful nature and not let it win. Because grumbling out loud, complaining to others, stirring things up, sharing the brokenness, that is not. But groaning. There are days when the very best thing you can do is say, God, I don't have any words. This is a tension I got to manage, certainly not a problem to solve. God, I just want you to know, God, I understand. It's temporary. It's painful. We live in this broken world. I get that, God. And there's something better coming, but And not only when you're suffering, but can I encourage you with this, that when you come across someone else who is suffering, instead of flippantly quoting Romans 8:28 to them in some way that you think is going to magically make everything feel better, I'll just say this. When I've been suffering, the most helpful thing that people have done in my life is they've come up to me and they've groaned. When my dad died, I didn't need someone to come and say, oh, it's all going to be all right. Oh, he's in heaven. Oh. I needed someone to come up to me and be like, Greg, and give me a big hug. And when we were trying to adopt 3 little girls, and we thought that's where it was going, and we had fallen in love with them, and we had prepared our home for them, and then it all fell apart like that. I didn't need somebody to come with explanation. I didn't need someone to quote a scripture verse to me. I didn't need that. I needed someone to walk into my life, and thank God they were. And they just walk in and they're like, oh, Greg, give me a hug. Groaning is one of the healthiest spiritual practices that you can have. And I want to encourage you to embrace it, both between you and God, and when you see someone else suffering, just groan with them and love them and embrace them and walk with them. The passage goes on. It says, but hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. Now, Paul's going to turn logical on us here. And I want you to see and embrace the logic. He's saying, sometimes we use the word hope, but we want it to be solved right now. And he says, that's not what hope is. The one way I can take your hope, one of the ways I can take your hope away, is actually to solve your problem. Then you don't have hope anymore. There's no anticipation for what is to come. And many people walk through suffering in a way that is hopeless. And there's nothing worse than suffering and being hopeless. If you're a follower of Jesus, there is no reason for your suffering to be hopeless. There is always an anticipation that one day this will be made right. That suffering is inevitable, but misery, that's optional. We don't have to be miserable because we understand that in the calculation, one day, something better, far better, is coming. In the same way, the Spirit helps us. And if you remember from last week or from any of your studies, the Spirit is what we receive, the Holy Spirit, at justification. It's with us through sanctification. The Spirit is the nature of the Spirit is one of the wrestling matches that we have in our life. It's either going to the flesh or going to the Spirit. And he's saying the Spirit will help us. It helps us in our weakness. We don't know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. Not only are we groaning, the Spirit is groaning. And he who searches our hearts and knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. And I just want you to appreciate this. that even the Spirit of God, even when you're praying to God, you can just kind of let the Spirit grow. Let me keep moving. And we know, this is Romans 8:28, that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. Now, this is critically important, and I want you to understand what Romans 8:28 is teaching. First of all, it is true that this is in all things. That in all things, not some things, not some people's lives, not like in all things, God is at work for the good of those who love him. And it's an acknowledgement that there is a real battle that's going on in this world. It's too simple to think of a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other shoulder. And yet I do want us to appreciate that what's going on for the control of our minds and the control of our hearts and the course that we're setting our lives on is a battle. And the battle that God is waging for you is that he's working for good. But the way you and I define good means everything in this passage. You see, one of the challenges for us, and I'll include myself in this for sure, is that almost all American Christians define good as comfort. Well, I know what I want. I want relief from the pain. I want comfort. And so when I pray and when I think, how is God doing his work in me? I think that this means he's working for my comfort. I'm going to pop your bubble a little bit and say, no, that's not what the passage teaches. When the passage says that in all things, God is working for the good of those who love him and who are called according to his purpose, it then tells us what the definition of good is. Good is being conformed to the image of his Son. And this is a wrestling match for every American Christian I know. To think, well, what's the aim of my life? What am I hoping will come about during this sanctification process? And for many American Christians, we default to the idea that, well, the aim must be relief. The aim must be comfort, but that is not the aim, and that is not what God is working toward. God is working toward utilizing the suffering that you and I are going through to make us more like his Son. And I want to call on every one of you who is a follower of Jesus to make sure that you've adjusted the North Star of your life spiritually. Say, no, I'm not going for comfort. That's not what I'm going for. I want to become more and more like Christ. That's what good is. That I would handle things like Christ, that I would live with the strength of Christ, that I would handle my relationships like Christ does, that I would be generous like Christ, that I would be forgiving like Christ, that I would endure persecution like Christ, that I wouldn't get angry like Christ. The goal of your life, the goal of our sanctification is that we'd become like Christ. That's what good is, and that's the purpose that God is working for in the midst of your suffering. And so yesterday, actually, I just reached out to 5 people in my life who I know pretty well, and I know who have gone through a lot in the last year or so. And I thought, I'll ask him this question. I kind of framed it like this. I said, hey, I know you've been through a lot. I've seen you actually walk through this with faith and grow. If you had to fill in this blank, if you said, hey, I wouldn't wish what I've gone through on anyone, but I am thankful that blank. How would you fill in the blank? And I expected to get a couple sentences back from each person and thought, well, some of them may not even reply. And I can tell you that very quickly, as soon as I texted these friends, I got a flood back from them. Can I read some of them to you? Because I think this helps us see that the goal is to become like Christ. One of my friends found out about 6 months ago that his mom was dying. And then he went through a months-long process of caring for his mom, trying to walk this road with his mom. And then within the last couple of months, his mom passed away. This is what he said. He said, I'm thankful for now understanding that spending time is the best way to love someone. Don't miss that. What if God needed to use our suffering to make us more like Christ, to remind us that spending time with someone is the best way to love someone? I'm thankful for those people that jumped in that dark hole with me and walked shoulder to shoulder with me to ensure that I was able to get out of it. That with this suffering, though he'd wish it on no one, he discovered people who would walk with him. I'm thankful for understanding that even those moments when you can't seem to talk to God, having other people pray on your behalf truly does help. And I'm like, you don't get those lessons without suffering. I reached out to a friend of mine who recently has lost kind of the central relationship of his life, ended up actually losing his job at the same time. Lowest of the low. He simply said this. He said, if that had not happened, then what I have seen is that it's only for God to become more evident, more present, more guiding, to work a regeneration in me that I didn't understand I needed. You hear what he's saying? That when life was smooth, I didn't see the need to become more like Christ. But in this, it brought that about. I reached out to a friend of mine who went through a divorce this past year. And I have a lot of respect for how she's navigated it. That's what she said. She said, I'm thankful for the lowest points. The moments when as high as I can go is to my knees. And that changes things, right? In those times I learn about and experience God's grace, his provision, his forgiveness, and his presence. Those are the moments where my heart and my mind are exposed in all their sinful nature. I mean, hear what she's saying. She's saying, I went through this, and it wasn't all somebody else. When I went through this, I saw things about myself that I didn't like. And God used this process to open my eyes to me. God has brought me to those moments of pain, emptiness, and submission for the sole reason of my repentance and complete surrender to his will. I don't wish suffering on anyone, but I do want people to experience that. And this is the work that God does. This is the good he does, bringing us into the likeness of his son. We have a young mom in our church who was diagnosed with breast cancer this past year. And it's, oh my goodness. I can't imagine. She said, I'm actually thankful for the unique perspective my cancer diagnosis and treatment has given me. It's caused me to soften my expectations and my plans. It's made me more flexible and willing to give grace. Everyone's battling something, and to me, no single person's battles are above or below my own. And then she said this, I've become more vulnerable and surrendered, having to lean on God and my family and my community of people who I'm just so grateful to have. Talk about humbling for a 38-year-old working mom who grew up in a culture of we can do it all and have it all. She says, I cry more than I ever have, but it's usually because I've realized how precious each day is. You know, these are the things that actually only suffering can sanctify in our lives. And then she said this. And while I probably wrestle with my faith the most I ever have in my life, I feel more authentically in tune with myself and my soul now more than ever, even while feeling disconnected from my physical body most days. Wrestling with my faith is a blessing. Every time I try to control an outcome or an expectation, God reminds me that He is in control, and He brings me to the other side of it, even if I'm kicking and screaming. And I'm asking you to follow her lead. We have a couple in our church whose daughter was diagnosed with cancer and has spent the whole last season of life making sometimes weekly trips downtown Chicago, just fighting this cancer that their daughter has. And I've watched them walk through it. I've prayed with them as they've walked through it. And I've seen how this suffering, how in all things God has worked for the good to make them more like Him. Just read a few things they wrote. It made us ask others for prayers and see God work in those prayers. Others prayed when we didn't have the strength to pray ourselves. We're thankful for the care and concern of others who pitched in to help us with meals and everyday things that were made challenging at times. As parents, we have greater compassion for other people going through something hard and wanting to help in some way. This is the purpose of suffering. That as we go through it, and it remains a tension to be managed, not a problem to be solved, that it would sanctify us. And I want to encourage you not just to pray for comfort or for relief, but to say, God, what is the work you are doing in me that will make me more like you, that I can only learn through this? The passage ends this way. And those He predestined, He also called. Those He called, He also justified. And those He justified, He also glorified. We live in the middle of that. And I want to pray over all of you in your suffering right now, that God would do His work in you to use this suffering to make you more like His Son.
If you want to learn about all the amazing things going on around here at Suncrest, you can always either download the Suncrest app, which has great tools. It has Bible reading plans, a history of messages, and so much more for you to get plugged into. Or you can head to suncrest.org/top4 to see what we believe would be the top 4 things you should know if you're looking to take steps in your journey on your faith and your journey with Suncrest. So, if you're looking to get plugged in, go ahead and download the Suncrest app or head to suncrest.org/top4.
Darkness run for cover, but the miracle that I just can't get over, my name is registered in heaven. I believe in signs and wonders. I have resurrection power. Still the miracle that I just can't get over, my name is registered in heaven. Oh, my place belongs here forever. This is my testimony from death to life. 'Cause grace rewrote my story. I'll testify by Jesus Christ the righteous. I'll testify. This is my testimony. This is my testimony. This is my testimony. Oh, I'm alive. This is my testimony. From death to life. 'Cause grace rewrote my story. I'll testify. By Jesus Christ the righteous, I'll testify. This is my testimony. This is my testimony.
Every week, we pause everything we do, both in person and on demand, to focus on the love of Jesus during a time we call communion. It's where those of us who follow Jesus take bread and juice that represents his body and his blood broken and poured out for us so that we might know what real love and life can look like. It's a moment to realign, refuel, and refocus us on Jesus, his love, and how it changes us, and how it can fuel us to change the world. If you're watching this and you wouldn't define yourself as someone who follows Jesus, you're just exploring what it would even look like, I'm glad you're watching, because Suncrest is an amazing and a safe environment for you to ask all of your questions about what it would look like for you to be on a faith journey of your own alongside lots of other people on the same journey as you. I'm going to put a timer, some scripture on the screen here shortly, and I want to invite you to eat, drink, and reflect when you're ready. If you liked this video, go ahead and hit the like button. If you know someone who needs to hear it, hit the share button. And if you want to see more content like this from Suncrest Church, go ahead and hit subscribe on our YouTube channel. I hope you join us next week as we continue another episode of Suncrest On Demand. And until then, I hope you experience change that only comes from following Jesus. Bye now.